Hello and welcome to Profiles in Risk. This is your host, Tony Cañas, and December 21st, recording today with Chris Cline, a longtime insurance person, former BMX athlete, fellow bench warmer on the basketball side of sports, and a longtime insurance professional and podcast host for the insurance industry, and now first-time author of The Inertia of Legacy. Chris, how's it going today?
It's going fantastic. And I just have to stop right now. And can we just say sort of like semi-retired BMXer? I hate the word former. I feel like this is a lifelong thing. And I
You're
actually
still
have,
getting on a bike every once in a while?
yeah, I raced a few times in 2023, and I've got a couple of buddies who've been kind of poking me in the ribs saying, "Hey, let's go. Let's get out and ride some more."
And
And I mean, in the spirit of the book we'll talk about, I am committed to riding my bike more and racing some more in
and,
2020.
and, and when you say race, you mean still BMX style, like hills and stuff?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh
Yeah.
wow, good for you. Good.
Yeah, I think
I'm only 41, and I would break into 16 pieces trying to do anything on a bike other than like a flat road. So
I
that's
can tell you
impressive.
the riding the bike isn't what breaks you. It's when you fall off the bike and hit the ground that you get broken. That
Right.
hurts. And I'm a few years older than 41, Tony, and I
Oh.
can assure you that when you crash, you are immediately reminded of how old you are.
All right. So the whenever anybody within the insurance space writes a book, I immediately send a message out saying, "Hey, let's come on the podcast." Right, and 95% of the time, I have not yet touched the book. Sometimes the book hasn't even come out, but I love having authors on the show. So the word legacy in the title, I 100% assumed that we were talking about legacy software in our industry, and how hard it is to get off of it, right? Uh, this book is much more interesting than that.
End of show. That's all I needed to hear. All you needed to say was no, I appreciate that. Yeah.
uh, so I really connected with the intro, the where you basically your story is very uh very unusual, kind of like mine, where you've just kind of done a lot of different things, had a lot of different interests along the way, uh and and so you start building the book on this idea of major decisions that you might not even know are major, right? Having to choose between BMX, which you loved as a teenager, and basketball, which I had never really thought about it, having grown up as a foreigner. My impression is Americans are just obsessed with sports in general, but yes, Midwestern high school sports, it's football and basketball, right?
That's it.
Even back in the 80s when BMX was very popular, uh, it just was, it's not one of the traditional sports, right? Uh, so anyway, I love how you built it on top of that, and if I hadn't even read the cover, the whole Science Geeks Guide. Uh, so at this point, I've mostly confused the listeners. So what is this book? What is the Inertia of Legacy?
Yeah, it's thank you for that. I will say the word legacy in the context that you reference was an inspiration or a motivation is probably a more accurate word. So somewhat of a condensed version of this. I was some science junkie as a kid and then sort of migrated away with that. And then in recent years, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, something like that, I really rediscovered my love of science and astronomy, not astrology, right? Astronomy, the space and the universe and all of the types of things that come along with that, and physics. I was never really a math I was never really good at math, but I was fascinated by what we were able to think about and how we were able to think about complex things through math. And so I was just consuming stuff again. I mean, some of the podcasts I listened to, even when I hosted a show, most of the stuff I was consuming was Lex Friedman and Neil deGrasse Tyson, which is, sort of like romper room science, but at least it's still science. And so I started to just consume that and take notes and journal. I'm a big fan of journaling. We talk about that as a tool in the book as well. And somewhere along the way, 5, 6 years ago, I started to think about some of these scientific principles as an analogy or a metaphor for real life. And could we learn from something that's very, very complex and, again, science-y, and translate the learning or the principles into something in our daily lives, our personal or professional lives, whether it's an individual, family member, community member, employee, or whether you even own a business. And so I started to scribble down like 7 or 8 of these scientific principles, thoughts about how they might be applicable to a more everyday life. I mean, it's in jest, right? We all learned about this stuff in elementary school or high school, and certainly if you went on into any sort of the STEM type disciplines, you got really good at it. So why not translate it into some meaningful life? Everybody always says, "What? How am I ever going to use algebra again?" Well, let's think about it. So all that was happening, and then actually inside our industry, I started to really take note and become guilty, if you will, of using the word legacy to describe legacy companies. The word legacy agency started to show up, legacy employees, and certainly legacy software, as like you said. And so didn't think anything about it, right? Thought it was like a romantic way of, kind of talking about high tenured, well-established type firms. But the tone, whether it was intentional or not, the tone there started to also include some vibe around being maybe a little bit slower, a little bit more resistant to change, not necessarily as forward-looking and sophisticated. And I was actually having a conversation with an agent who said, "Don't call me a legacy agent. Like, just don't." And I really marinated on that on the flight home or the drive home or whatever it was. And I thought, yeah, we are. Why does a word legacy generally conjure up positive thoughts? We think about something that people build and they leave, and yet here we are having procured it and applied a use for it that really didn't seem to fit. Now, being slow and resistant to change can be a legacy, but that's not the definition of legacy. And so that was something I was gyrating on, and I decided I would try not to use it. I still fail every single day probably and use that word in a way I wouldn't love, but then just through some dumb luck, Tony, I was reading or listening to something, and this whole concept of inertia, Newton's laws of motion, the 3 primary laws, and it kind of hit me that if we don't like the legacy or we don't like something, you can do something about that. And so this idea of inertia is an object at rest stays at rest unless acted upon by another force. An object in motion stays in motion. So if nobody does anything, or if we don't apply anything, or if you don't apply some intent to what your legacy is, it's not going to change. And I started to spin around on that. And so this idea of the inertia of legacy was, hey, if we really care about legacy, what you build, what you manage, and what you leave, and ultimately I would suggest, and I think it's a bold statement, but is there ultimately anything more personal than a legacy? Then why do so few people do anything about it? Which is another kind of scientific-y thing here we explore in the book. But so I kind of pieced all that together, and I just thought, hey, let's take this idea, let's be our own force, let's be our own inertia, which is a little bit of a liberal interpretation of inertia, and apply it to legacy. And that's where this whole idea of the inertia of legacy came from, and became a brand and really a rallying cry and a concept that I'm applying across a couple of other areas of my life. But it started to become something that felt like a concept I could build and explore. And really my idea was, could I turn this thing into like an hour keynote? And I kept going and going and going. And finally, the COVID thing and some other personal things in my life, I thought, you only live once, no regrets. And I literally sat down Monday morning of Thanksgiving week in 2022, so just over a year ago, popped open my laptop and started writing. And now here we are talking about a fully published book based off of that concept.
I really liked the the concept of being our own force that right moves you from inertia. And yeah, it's not, you know, not super physicsy, if that's a word, but I do think that it is good to call it out that you don't need something else to get you going. You just have to get yourself going. Um,
Well, to that point, like the way I think about it is every single person, every single business does have and will leave a legacy, whether they're doing anything about it or not. So in the concept of inertia, this is an external force. There are people that have a view of you, or maybe even worse, they completely don't have an opinion of you at all. It could be positive, it could be negative, or whatever it was, but in that spirit, we're all leaving a legacy. And so the idea is, if that matters to you, first of all, I challenge the notion that it should matter to you at some level, then do something about it. And we can be more intentional about it. And there are some very practical tools in the book beyond this esoteric and odd combination of things that we can chat about if you want. But yeah, it does challenge you. And there are a collection of forces. Your lack of action and the thoughts and opinions of other people are creating a legacy for you. So if you care at all, let's do something about it.
The quadrants,
Yeah.
I thought was a good systematic way to kind of map it all out and help me find where I am. How did that idea come? Well, did you already know that you were going to use the quadrants when you started writing, or once you started writing it seemed like a good way to explain it?
Well, the latter. And it was also an interesting exercise in sometimes you have to trust the process a little bit and immerse yourself in something. And I believe that one of the reasons why it took me a while to start writing was that it didn't feel cohesive enough or objective enough to deliver to anybody else. Like, I mean, I knew what was going on in my own mind. I could make sense of it, but I didn't feel confident that I could position that in a way that would make sense to others. But I thought, I'm just going to start writing. And I mean, gosh, I don't know, a few dozen hours at least into writing when I was starting to come to the terms of, like, I'm dealing with two disparate concepts here. This idea of inertia, amount of effort and energy, and then the overall health of one's legacy. And then I realized, like, we've all grown up in a world, most of us anyways, where you've seen a simple 2-axis graph. Pretty basic, especially in our insurance industry. We use this a lot to look at ratios and growth and sales velocity and hit ratios and all of these kind of things. They're all essentially two variable ratios. And I thought, well, gosh, let me play around with what this could look like if we took this idea of how much effort and energy somebody is putting into defining and managing their legacy, and then what is the overall state or health of their legacy, and plot those against each other on a 2-axis graph. You, by default, when you put 2 axes together like this, you get 4 quadrants that become very unique combinations of those 2 variables. And so I literally have a sketchbook here where I was kind of playing around with stuff. And the first time I plotted the sketch, it took me forever, and publisher and I brainstorming like literally till the 11th hour to come up with a name for these. We had descriptions, but we didn't come up with names, and they should be somewhat physicsy or somewhat in theme. We played around with like cartoon characters, like this is the underdog and this is Superman, and it seems sort of out of theme, but this is where we got. And so it was one of those things that just, the proverbial, it just came to me in a moment. But I was just fully immersed. And that's what I mean. Sometimes you can't wait to have everything to start. Trust yourself. You believe in something and just go.
There was one of the quadrants I really liked. I'm trying to remember the name. I did the audiobook version, so I don't have it in front of me.
Okay. Yeah.
So there is an audiobook version, by the way, for everybody that's wondering. So the what was it? The dangerously inert
Oh, perilously inert.
perilously inert. I thought was a fantastic name, and I can definitely see a lot of people in our industry, because our industry is very stable, uh,
Yeah.
and that does lead to some level of perilous inertia, both for organizations and for people in the industry. I thought you did a really good job of helping us identify that, holy crap, this is like, am I perilously inert, and also making it very very clear that you're not dead. You can change. You right. The step one is the awareness of where you are, and then here are the tools to help you move towards where you want to be and moving in the right direction.
Well, yeah, I appreciate that. And we can chat a little bit about the other quadrants, but so perilously inert, visually, I'm good doing the whole thing is on the quadrant, it's the lower left. So it is a quadrant that represents little or no effort to manage or define your legacy, and you have a poor or undefined legacy. So it's really the worst of the two. And then the opposite quadrant is really just that. It's somebody has a healthy legacy and they are also intentional about it. And we can talk about these other ones because there's some really unique examples in our industry, particularly as you start to think about an employee working their way through their career, for example, or an independent agency going through merger and acquisition or succession or lack of succession or those kind of things. But it's interesting, and there's a lot of insurance industry translation here. Right or wrong, we intentionally didn't categorize the book in Amazon with being attached to insurance because it seemed like I had, more broad
Definitely.
application. So I've done insurance my whole life. So it's woven throughout. But if you're listening and you're not an insurance professional or somebody in your life might just be wanting to think a little bit about how to become the best version of themselves, it applies as well. So it kind of fits both. But you're right. The thing is, I remember having this epiphany almost in the book, and I let the epiphany play out where it was like knowing where you are is important. And it was like if you feel negative about where you are today, or if you're honest about it, that can elicit certain set of emotions. But the idea is that wherever you are today, I mean, it's important to understand, but it's more important to think about what you do next because you can't get anywhere with any efficiency unless you know where you are today. And that's why I spent a little bit of time saying I encourage everybody to read all 4 chapters because at some point, or about all 4 quadrants, because you might have different thoughts about where you are, but it also helps you kind of think through what it will look like as you progress or navigate, or could go backwards, I guess is a way of thinking about it. But also when you think about the fact nobody's doing this alone, and we all have other human beings in our life. We all have businesses that we interact with. And so to have a perspective on how to understand where somebody else might be is really important to think about how you relate. But none of these are death sentences. I mean, you might hate where you are today. Cool. Do something about it, right? I mean, we've all been in a spot where we're not happy. And also being in uniform motion. That's the plus plus quadrant, if you will. That's not a permanent medal either. Like you don't get to keep the trophy forever because it does take intention to keep the inertia going. And there are external forces constantly working against you. If you're employed in an organization, there's organizational change, there's market conditions. Maybe there's somebody who doesn't have your best interest. Not everybody roots for us to win. And then if you own a business, right, there could be competitors in town, and interest rates could go up, catastrophes could happen. Whatever the thing is, there are always forces at play working against you. And then from inside too, are you really focused on where you're going? And we could talk a little bit about it too, but that's why I use the analogy of a gyroscope to kind of sort through all of these things. But I'll stop right there. Maybe I've meandered too much.
No, you're perfectly fine. Um, from when so you sat down to start writing Thanksgiving a year ago. Once you submitted that draft, uh, what were you most surprised about?
It's a great question. How little change in concept and flow that we worked through in the editing process. And so one of the epiphanies I had, epiphanies is the wrong word, learnings, just technical learnings. So I was building the thing, I was writing, I was starting to talk to folks I know in the industry, and even some folks out of the industry that not everybody, but the people I knew that were really friendly, that were like, I know somebody who wrote a book, some self-published, some work with a publisher, somebody used to work at a trade magazine, whatever the thing is. I was learning that there were a couple of different and very different approaches to editing. And it hit me that I was going to be out of pocket, a real amount of money, and I was going to have to subcontract at least the technical editing, the commas and the grammar and those kind of things. I can't send a 3-sentence email without a typo. So there was no way in the world I was going to publish a couple 100-page book without typos. And so I started to talk about that around and realized that, well, one of the things I struggled with was a truly subcontracted editor, which, you can farm those out. There's resources you can go to where people it would probably be okay, but this is a weird concept, and the editor wouldn't be fully invested in it, right? They would put in their hours, they would get billed, and I would send them a check. And then there's continuity or concept editing. Somebody reading it, does this make sense? You're weaving this thread, but you gotta go over here. And so there was a perfect example. There was a section in the book in the what's next. So I spent a lot of time talking about, okay, if you wrap your head around this thing, we've all heard a speaker, we've all been to a conference, we were motivated, and then 2 weeks later nothing's different. So I spent a lot of time like, what the heck do you do next? But in that, the editor, the publisher actually wrote back and said, hey, this is garbage. Like, it's meandering, it's all over the place, you restate some stuff. And so I'm like reading it, and at first I was like, this makes pretty good sense to me, what are you talking about? And then like all of a sudden I realized I felt like I was going in circles, and all I could deduce, Tony, was that I wrote the same section twice, but at different times. And therefore, that's what's crazy about this stuff when you really think about it. Like, your mood, your disposition, the things you're dealing with in life, they change every single day. These are these forces that we talk about. And over like a 4 or 5 or 6 month period, a lot of times you had to reread stuff to figure out like, what's my frame of mind now that I'm back into it. Best thing I can think of, though, back to that, is I probably just cut and pasted these things together and didn't even realize I'd written the same thing. So then I spent some time going back through it, and how do I take the best from all of it? And quite honestly, I said, just the heck with it. Like, this section, it just deleted a whole section. But I say all that in that, there was a lot of grammar and punctuation type things, which I think was great when we went through the process. But the publishing process was, or the working with trying to find somebody to publish the book, I had to write a synopsis. I didn't know what it was. I talked to a couple folks and they go, well, tell me about your book. Send me a synopsis. Well, what's a synopsis? So I have to figure out what that is. And then I stop writing and I go write one. Then I had a conversation, ultimately, Peter Raitt from Wells Media ultimately took my phone call and we had a conversation, and he kind of like you was like, I don't know that anybody's talking about math and physics and professional development. Tell me more. And I sent him the synopsis. And it wasn't very long. And he wrote back and he says, I'm in. Like, I want to figure out a way to do this, to do this book. So it was just this. Oh, okay, what does that mean? I don't know, right? But I'm back to saying that when we went through the process and had however their team worked through it, the how humbling it was and rewarding it was to hear them say, like, we want your voice, we want your story, we want this to come out and not to be so overly sanitized. And so I went into it with a very with a strong set of fears and anxiety that it would come back just slaughtered. Like, this doesn't make sense, nobody will follow this. And maybe that's the case, but it was a fascinating process in that regard to take something that was very, very personal, and that I had, probably 200 hours in of computer time plus years of building, and to give it to somebody with the explicit intent of telling you what needed to be changed. And it was fascinating.
So it came out, I think, October 4th, right?
Uh,
Lines, I
I
think.
think it was the 10th, but yeah,
Okay.
first early October.
So going on a couple of months since it came out, what's been the reception like?
I mean, I sound cheesy when I say this, and I'm just trying to be as authentic and I mean, I've been moved to tears literally by some of the feedback. You put it out there. When I was self-publishing, I had in my mind that this was 100% for me. If anybody bought it other than my mom, that was going to be fantastic. And you get a little bit of and I know you work in the book space too. Like I think, I don't know if it's right or wrong, but my feeling was once I had a publisher who was invested in this, not only financially, but reputationally and just a lot of time, I felt a sense of obligation for that to be somewhat successful, for at least it to be worth their time. So was concerned about selling copies of it. That being said, I really don't have a perspective on how many have sold. And I've been reluctant to ask, across paper or hardcover, Audible, whatever. I mean, I am getting residual checks. I'm not hiding behind that. I mean, I don't have a summer home or anything from this book, as we've joked. So I can do some back math into how many of them sold, and it's way more than I would have ever thought. Um, that being said, that's less important than the feedback I'm getting from people, close friends. You would think they would shoot you a note of confidence, but you can tell they're reading the book. They're taking, hey, this section you said here, or this piece here, this really resonated. And even after this time now, like, I go back and I was like, I should probably go reread that. Like, what moved them about that? Because in the moment you're just free flowing, and that's deeply touching. But then I'm getting messages from people that are casual acquaintances at best, and people I've never met. Like, a friend of a friend told me I should check this thing out, and I did, and it's just, I mean, it's weird and rewarding and humbling and all of those words that you just, who knows? And I really have a hard time articulating the emotion from the fact that something that was such a passion project for me is helping other people think about something differently.
I agree with you completely the number sold is much less important than the fact that it's having an actual effect on people. As we discussed before we started recording, like, basically, unless you're Stephen King, you don't really make a living off of writing. Uh, but it can be incredibly rewarding to for me. every once in a while I run into a copy of my book out in the wild, that like visiting an insurance company or something like that. uh and or people mention it, and mine came out 2017.
Yeah,
As
it's been a while.
It's been a while, and people bring it up at different things, and or how it made a difference for them. And that's much more important, that how many copies sold. I couldn't tell you how many copies sold. We published it ourselves, and I couldn't tell you how many copies have sold.
Well, it's yeah, you're right. I mean, if it's something that you're doing with the explicit intent of what the cash on the back end looks like, I don't know that it would ever be as good as you would hope anyways. And the book sales is, I mean, it's a thing, right? I mean, I'm working with a company who is invested in this project, and I want them to at least feel like it was not a waste of time. I mean, that would break my heart. But again, whether 75 books or 750 books or 7,500 books, if if people are finding value in it and it's helping them, I love when it doesn't happen every day, but you wake up and a Facebook post or a LinkedIn post or somebody goes, hey, check it out, I got my copy of Chris's book and I'm making my way through it. And a lot of those come with a private message or a text or an email that says, hey, this is pretty cool. And like you started off with the opening story about BMX and basketball. Um, I've had some people say, like, it was refreshing that, because that's why I kind of said it's a weird book that it's written in the first person. So it was one thing I wasn't sure how that would relate, but people have kind of said that they learned a little bit about me, even though they've known me, because of how transparent I was about some things, especially in the introduction, and then some life experiences woven throughout about where I didn't even know that I was influencing what, my legacy was. And that some people might sound arrogant to talk about their legacy, but we're all leaving one. And so if I'm in the Midwest, I'm in a very small rural town, and you played football and basketball, and I was not good. And I picked the splinters out of my bottom of my gym shorts every Friday night and did the thing. And then I discovered BMX and got actually reasonably, good at it. And then when you make this decision in the 10th grade to stop playing a major sport in a rural high school, for another sport that wasn't associated with school, right? I mean, it's kind of an outlier sport then, and it still is. It was very real to the trajectory of my life and the interests I have and the people that I associated with. But in the moment, it was a really strong learning experience about how taking some control over your life, doesn't come without some shrapnel, and the crowd of people who welcome you changes immediately, and how you're treated by some people changes dramatically. And it's amazing. Who knew, right? I just wanted to race bicycles. I didn't care about sitting on the bench anymore.
I think it's a wonderful lesson, uh, in doing the introspection, figuring out what you really want to do, and then committing to it, even if your environment and, is not, the normal path in your environment. If you know it's the right thing for you, uh commit to it, and it'll probably pay off. You'll be better doing what you love doing than doing what's expected.
What's
uh
interesting, Tony, and I'll just real quick, because one of the other things I reckon I discussed briefly in the book was just what I studied in college. So I went to school to be an engineer, so it showed up here and everything. And um, it became very apparent in the middle of calculus too that I had no chops, for really going on and becoming an engineer. But I ended up graduating with a fine arts degree. I started my career as a graphic designer, and that's how I ended up at the company I worked for 30 years. with a phenomenal number of opportunities. But I remember vividly, it was like a Thursday night. I'm in college, and Thursday nights are when the weekend starts at most major schools. And my buddies were like, hey, we're getting ready to go out and hit the club or whatever. And I'm like, hey, wait a second, I'm still working on a project. I would just catch up with you guys later, if at all. And a couple of them busted my chops. I'm like, you're gonna sit here and draw rather than come out and have some beers or whatever. And I'm like, yeah, I love this thing. One of them made a comment that stuck with me to this day, and it's in the spirit of what you said. He said, must be nice to have a major that you love. And I was like, wow, it must suck to have a major that you don't love. Like, what are you doing? But being able to, I was so blessed to have supportive parents. I mean, my dad was an engineer. I went to study engineering, and I'm like, man, I don't want to study engineering anymore. They're like,
A lot of parents would have had serious issues with
no, they're like, what do you want to
major.
do? And I'm like, well, I want to create. I want to do things. I like to, but man, I don't know. Drawing out a carbon and hydrogen molecule model for some polypropylene garbage was not the way things were going to work for me, right? Um, and so yeah, I was very fortunate in that, but it was still a decision. And the person who I'm speaking of has gone on to have, a very nice life. But what could have been different had they just said, I really don't want to study this, I want to study that.
The I was laughing my butt off at the beginning of the book with the transfer from engineering to graphic design, and that bringing it to insurance of all things, right? Like the company didn't have that many graphic designers when they hired you. They don't have that many today, right? It's a very niche group, and
Well,
it's
yeah, imagine that, an engineering major changes to graphic design and then starts their career, and still is in it 30 plus years later in insurance. Those are very interesting things. But there was another one of the stories I talk about was even in my insurance career early on. I was a graphic designer. I was working for the advertising department, and I'd worked on a couple of projects, and I get this, I'd been there barely 2 years, so I'm pretty young. I got the call, a couple of the senior leaders, and they're like, hey, can you come to our office kind of thing? And at that point in time, that was still suits and wingtips and the whole 9 yards. And I thought I was done. I'm like, what I do wrong? I'm going to get fired. And it was a very positive thing, right? We love the way you think, and we're thinking about expanding some other functions. And you didn't really want to be a graphic designer forever, right? And I was like, well, I thought so. But it was tough love. You don't work for an ad agency, you work for an insurance company. And so you can, we're not going to let you go. But if you want a career here, it's not going to be this. And so I took a leap of faith, and it was just this thing that I think, like, had I not made that decision at 26 years old, 0% chance you and I are on this call right now. 0% chance. Fascinating.
Yeah, it really is. Beyond the book, so you're getting involved in a couple of other things around the industry. You're starting to write for Stacey King's Culture is King,
Yeah.
which I feel I know everybody that's writing for that,
Yeah,
and
she's doing a great thing with that.
yes, my girlfriend Renee is writing for it. Brian Falchuk, just a ton of people that I know and respect. So your first article is published. Uh, it's an interesting topic. It's an interesting topic. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that one?
Yeah, I had to stop for a second and think what I submitted to her, because there's a couple of things I've become, and always was. I've just been a huge, only because I was forced to become, for my own benefit, a student of emotional intelligence. And that, I think, has morphed on to my desire to help other people and to think about culture differently and inclusion. And, again, I was a BMXer in a local school. I was an art major. I've always been somewhat of an outlier, and always been sort of aware of that. But in recent years, have felt, called sounds cheesy, but felt moved to try to help. And getting to know Stacy and her story, I mean, it's heartwarming and heartbreaking all at the same time. So, um, but culture is a thing, and it's a word that gets used a lot. I feel like it unfairly gets categorized as a buzzword and gets bantered about as like, hey, whatever, we got the pool table and the keg and whatever. It means a lot. It means a lot. And so, having gone through a seismic career change of my own, it's kind of permitted me to think differently and have some different perspectives. I get to have different conversations with people around the industry too. Now I may or may not be a competitor, or I'm in a different spot, those kind of things. And some of the things that I've started to explore as I've talked to others and then just seen through some personal experiences is that there's way more to a healthy culture than the words on the slide or the messages from on high, and the leadership being aligned, and certainly the working environment. They're all a part of it. And so the premise of the article is what you permit, you allow, and ended up becoming a keynote I did, or a session I did at another industry event. But the idea is that it's kind of the weakest link thing. And if there is misaligned behaviors in an organization, however big or small it is, in a team, in a small company, or in a really large company, eventually others will see those misaligned behaviors and start to question how sincere an organization is about the culture they're portraying matters, because here's somebody who's allowed to behave in a way that is counter to that. And then ultimately, if you allow it, certainly if you celebrate it, if you promote it, if you recognize it, then at the best, people will start to question what the culture really is. At the worst, the misaligned behavior truly becomes somewhat cancerous and will actually become the culture. And so
Absolutely.
it's, if you permit it, you allow it. And I joke about it because it was like there was a prog rock band that was famous in the 70s called Kansas. And that was a line from one of those songs that I heard when I was a kid, and it always
I
stuck with me. But
that,
the idea is, when you think about that, I then empathize with an organization, right? Because I think most organizations that go through the effort of putting a culture first view are sincere. Like, they really want to create a great
yeah,
environment. But it isn't easy, especially if you got a lot of employees. Well, I think if you have more than one employee, it's not easy, because you got two people sitting next to each other, you got two different perspectives on things. But the idea is, I think that cultural coaching starts with transparency. What are the cultures? What are the behaviors? How are they modeled? I ultimately think, and I explore this as an action, I think they should be baked into job descriptions. I think they should be baked into performance management, or at least coaching, and then treat it as, like, through the lens of noble intent. If you've got somebody who's not necessarily in lockstep, you owe them the chance to get better. Hey, we're noticing this is what we're trying to do. Here's a way to get better. Here's some tools. Here's a mentor, whatever. But in the presentation I did on this, I think I talked about it in the article, but definitely the presentation I did is like, I don't think we as an industry, I don't think we as a culture or as a society, so this isn't an insurance industry indictment, we're not very good at addressing misaligned behavior. And I think if you
absolutely.
give everybody a chance to succeed, there'll be a point in time where it becomes obvious that they don't. And oh, that's just Tony. Let it, people give up on that. And we have to be willing, maybe to my own detriment someday, to invite somebody to go work somewhere else.
I have lived it twice, on both extremes. On one hand, when I was at Nationwide, spent 6 months at Scottsdale Insurance in the finance department, and there was Nationwide's a very friendly company in general, Midwestern nice, right?
Yeah, sure.
And the Scottsdale brand out in Scottsdale, Arizona, in general, was same culture. There was one guy in the finance department who was just a complete ass. They're just a complete ass to everybody,
Yeah.
and proud of it. And the problem is, he was super productive as a finance person,
That's
right?
always what happens, right? They're
Otherwise,
technically
like,
proficient, they're competent,
he
they're
would
highly,
still be there, right?
but
Uh,
nobody wants to work with them.
and luckily, I was only there for a few months because it was a specific rotation, but it stuck in mind how this coordinate, how it didn't fit to the rest of nation or the rest of Scottsdale. Years later, I ran into uh, the person that this guy reported to. So years later, like we're talking like 2 years ago, and I'm no longer with Nationwide. He's no longer at Scottsdale. And I asked about this person, and I didn't go out of my way to say, he was an ass when I was there, but just, hey, do you remember, right? And he went out of his way to say, yeah, if I could have only locked him in a room and had him produce reports, he would have been fine. But he just couldn't get along with anybody, and I'm like, why did you keep him so long, right?
Well, we all know too. I mean,
Was productive,
you're
right?
in, I mean, you're in the HR world too, and I mean, you just don't get to wave a magic wand and let somebody go. And which is a good thing. I do think people deserve the
Yes,
benefit of the
yes.
doubt and the opportunity
Um,
to skin their knees
but
and grow. I mean,
it,
I've
it
been the beneficiary of second chances. We all have, right? But hopefully you learn from those coaching experiences, and there's just a time and a spot where it's okay to say this isn't
but
working.
on the other hand, at my last job, so before running my own shop, at the largest insurance recruiter in the US, um, this particular woman won the highest sales for the year, end of the second year that I was there, and got fired 3 or 4 months later. So when she got fired, it was a lot of what happened, right? And it turns out she had been always a top producer, uh, had been on a performance improvement plan for mistreating the support staff, had survived the performance improvement plan, and then started doing it again,
No,
right?
of course. Yeah.
And even though she was a top producer year after year and had just been the biggest salesperson in the company the prior year, uh, they didn't put up with it, and it really shows in the culture. Right? Like, you've put your money where your mouth is, and you've shown every employee that yes, no, this, our culture is really this. If you can't fit into it, even after multiple opportunities, uh, we won't let you become a cancer here. I was very impressed
That's
by
neat.
that. So yeah, I've definitely seen it. I agree completely. You mentioned diversity. Um, and given that this doesn't go out till January, I think we can mention out loud that you've now joined the board of Insure Equality, which I've been on for the last year. So first of all, congratulations for that.
Thank you.
Uh,
Yeah.
so I am very curious. Um, so I learned from the book that, like myself, you're a bit of a weirdo for our industry, right? But you do have the benefit.
I wear that as a badge of honor, my friend.
Yes, but you do have the benefit of looking pretty normal in the room surrounded by insurance people, right? So why do you believe that diversity and inclusion in our industry is so important that you're literally joining the board of Insure Equality?
I wish it was as simple as a one-liner. I think it goes
I know
back
this is a
to,
longer conversation.
but I think it is rooted in the experiences I have. And like you're right. I mean, I look a lot like our industry, but I've even dealt with raised eyebrows and I think some challenges, and not just in corporate America, but just, some of these other things along the way. And I just, I felt like we as a society just don't give enough opportunity for people who just bring a different thought. We don't we don't have enough of that. And so I've always felt that. And I will credit my former employer for being really involved and investing in diversity efforts. And I mean, I didn't know there was a word or a label for these things, and I started to get more involved. And I'm like, guys, yeah, I can see this thing. And I don't know. I mean, you could ask the people that I've had a chance to work with. I I feel like I was a leader who tried to give people with different thoughts an opportunity to have a comparable voice. And all of these things coalesced into just feeling like I was drawn to these diversity and initiatives in the industry. And when I would see people that I held in high regard, a lot of times because of their professional chops, talk about it's like females in leadership, right? That was really kind of my first entry point into that. I'm like, gosh, I kind of see some things here. And then I see some people that I hold in very high regard talk about pay disparity and opportunity disparity. And then you start to read the statistics about
Awful.
how few women are in the boardrooms or in C-suite things. And then it it really it gave me this level of discomfort, but yet being my own inertia, I tried to put that in a way like I want to lean into this thing and figure out if I can be a part of influencing change. And then just starting to get involved in a couple of the ERGs in my
Fantastic.
own organization um and leaning into that. And I, the podcast I used to host, Closing the Gap, we did a number of episodes where we would interview Meg McKean's and then like John Lofton and MJ Insurance. I mean, folks who were coming at this, all of them were very educational for me and it was very inspirational. And I just felt like if I was to rewind the clock as somebody who was very different, even though I looked like everybody else in the room, I'm wired very different. I've heard that my whole life. And if I can be a part of giving one more person who is different a chance to have a seat at table they deserve to be at, I'm gonna. And so I don't know. I heard Elisa Stamp speak at
She's
InsurTech
amazing.
Boston.
Is a force of nature.
I mean,
Uh,
I mean, I'm getting, I don't know, moved by this. I'd heard about it and I had seen some of the folks on social media. I mean, we interact with a lot of the same circles and um some of my closest friends in the industry are folks who are very strong champions in this space as well. And I was just in SureTech Boston and Elisa comes up and she tells her story. And I was just like, this is something else. And connected and made formal connections at the meeting. And then, not too long ago, I had an opportunity. Hey, here's a connection. Here's what we're trying to do. Um, as an ally in the space, we have an opportunity to have this conversation. And I was really impressed with their process. I was like, how the heck am I going to get through this process? I mean, it was legit. Um, and just feel blessed to have an opportunity to be a part of it. In another angle too, that really has nothing to do with our industry, friend of mine is, have a very, very healthy local Goodwill, um, 500 plus employees, doing a lot of great things, very creative in how, they engage in the community. But I was a little guilty in that, I mean, you would hear the banter that the Goodwill is a place where you can go, you can donate some stuff and maybe you can get some discount items and the whole nine yards. And a friend of mine works for the Goodwill. He runs retail operations and he reached out to me and started to tell a little bit more about the story and what they do and how they are focused on helping people who have challenges getting into the workforce,
mhm.
whether they're handicapped or they have legal issues, whether they're widowed or single, they don't have transport. I mean, all people who are want
Yeah, on
to
the
be,
margins of employment.
yeah, and it like, oh my gosh, it hit me. And so I'm a part of that organization as well. And it's just another one of those things. I just feel like there's so many people out there that have more to give, that want to give and be a part and be a viable part of a business or a community that have barriers. And whether that's a handicap or whether that's a diversity issue. And I don't know. I keep saying I don't know, Tony. There's just something deep inside that says like
Good.
I've been very fortunate for somebody who is wired different than most in our industry, and that's been a blessing a lot of ways. And there's been times where that's just worked against me. And if I have any way in the world to help give somebody a voice that wouldn't otherwise get one, I'm gonna try.
Fantastic. Thank you. Running out of time here because I do have another podcast recording in 5 minutes. I don't want to make you late to your next meeting also.
That's
Thank you so much for your time today. The book is available on Amazon and on Audible. So
yep.
if like myself, you are a strong fan of audiobooks, check it out there. And when it goes live, I will tag you on LinkedIn. Thank you so much for your time today.
I appreciate it. I had a lot of fun, Tony. I really appreciate it. Thanks, man. Have a good weekend and a great holiday.